Welcome to Future Self Dreaming. My name is Carlos Kukulkan. In the last presentation, I shared some of my initiations into non-ordinary reality, encountering interdimensional beings whilst attending the advanced training workshops to become a facilitator of the Egyptian mystery school known as the Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life. In today's presentation, I'm going to follow on from these experiences with more initiations and interactions within non-ordinary reality that I had when traveling through Egypt in the weeks following the workshop that I'd attended. So after the advanced workshop, known as the Seed of Life, I spent several days exploring Chicago before leaving for Egypt the following week. And when browsing through a secondhand bookstore in Chicago, I came across a couple of books by the author Carlos Castaneda, which I had not read previously. Now, in the years prior, I'd been intrigued by the writings of Carlos Castaneda, who was a student of anthropology at UCLA and who'd undergone a shamanic apprenticeship in the Toltec lineage with a Yaqui Indian sorcerer or man of knowledge, whose name was Don Juan Matus. Over the next couple of weeks, as I began reading Carlos Castaneda's books, they made reference to the types of experiences that I'd had in the Seed of Life workshop the previous week, where I'd experienced myself as being in two places at once. The term that was used for this was called bilocation. And having a term for this experience and realizing that others such as shamans and yogis were aware of this phenomena helped me to integrate the experiences that I'd had the previous week during the workshop. Many of Carlos Castaneda's experiences are documented in his books, which are filled with tales of encounters with non-ordinary reality. He refers to shamanic terms to describe our usual state of consciousness associated with the everyday awareness as being the realm of the tonal, whilst encounters with non-ordinary reality reside in the realm of the nawal. In the shamanic ways of knowing taught to him, the access to these various perceptual realms is dependent on our reserves of energy and access to personal power, which can alter the location of light filaments within the energy body in the area behind the shoulder blades, which is known as the assemblage point. He describes that this point of perceptual assemblage also moves at times when we lucid dream, either in the waking or sleeping state, where we may gain access to expanded states of awareness and experience more synchronicity as a result. So as I continued my adventures in Chicago, everything seemed to be signposting my need to access these states through lucid dreaming practices. One of the obvious signs came when visiting a friend's house, and as we walked in, they were beginning to watch the movie called Waking Life, which is a film incorporating philosophical concepts encountered while the protagonist in the film is in a process of lucid dreaming. So after leaving Chicago the following week, I arrived in Egypt and I joined a group as part of a 15-day tour through Egypt. It was not a workshop group, nor was it a spiritually orientated group of people, but rather just regular tourists. I was traveling solo and I wasn't with anyone else from the previous workshop that I'd attended or anybody else that I knew. The itinerary for the first day of our tour was to visit the Giza pyramids and the Sphinx, followed by the Archaeological Museum, which is filled with Egyptian monuments that were absolutely mind-blowing. The Great Pyramid at Giza was one of the sites that I most looked forward to visiting, and I was somewhat disappointed to discover that it would not be possible for me to enter it due to a limit of a couple of hundred tickets per day being sold. But I knew that I had several days in Cairo after the tour finished, so my intention was to return to the Giza pyramids after this tour to enter the Great Pyramid. On the second day of the tour, the group took an overnight train to Luxor, where we were to board a boat, which we spent the next week travelling along the Nile upon. Now, while our boat was docked at Luxor, we had the opportunity to explore temple complexes at Karnak, which were the first of many temple complexes that we'd be visiting over the following 10 days. And I'd not really known what to expect of these temples and was awestruck by the size and the structure of such impressive monuments. In some ways, they were more impressive than the pyramids for me. While at Luxor, I had the opportunity to visit the Valley of Kings, and then during the next leg of our journey towards Aswan, our boat stopped at Kom Ombo, the Crocodile Temple, and again at the Temple of Horus. While docked at Aswan, we traveled by bus to the temple of Abu Simbel, which is almost equally impressive. The gigantic statues, stone statues carved into the side of the mountain, is the fact that the entire mountain temple had been disassembled into several million blocks before being reassembled several hundred meters above its original location, which was a mammoth engineering feat that was completed over several years to avoid the temple being lost below water after the construction of the Aswan Dam. For those of you who might be interested in ancient Egypt, I highly recommend a documentary series called Magical Egypt by John Anthony West, and another presentation called Megalithomania, which is a conference filled with presentations, which I think was organized by Michael Tellinger and others in South Africa. So after visiting Aswan, the following day we had an optional tour to the island of Philae. Our tour guide had told me that there was a smaller temple on the island of Philae dedicated to the deity Isis. And although I somewhat regretted it later, by that stage in my travels I felt that I had explored enough temples, and so I opted to have a day of rest and relaxation, choosing to stroll through the markets and relax on the boat. In the afternoon I found myself exhausted, and so I had a sleep on the boat. And while asleep, I had one of the most incredibly lucid dreams of my life. In that dream, I found myself walking along a street in Mexico, which I found quite unusual given that I knew that I was in Egypt at the time. And I was walking along this dirt road, following these electricity cables. There was nobody else on the street and no houses around apart from a single concrete construction, which more resembled a large box than a living abode. And I entered this complex and found it to be much larger inside than it appeared from the outside. As I entered, I was greeted by the most beautiful woman that I'd ever seen, and she was sitting in front of me on a bed, clothed only from the waist up, so she was exposing her vagina to me as we talked. And I knelt before her, and she began to impart great wisdom to me, that was feminine in nature and beyond any words that I have to describe. And I was extremely attracted to this radiant woman, feeling deep love towards her without any sexual desire for her exposed body. Then the two of us began to sense the imminent arrival of two men, and she began to leave the room, or she began to cover herself firstly, and I began to plead with her that it wasn't necessary for her to do so. Although she kind of acknowledged to me that her exposure was for me alone, and she proceeded to leave the room before these two men arrived. And as the two men entered this dwelling, I recognized the older of these two as the Yaqui Indian sorcerer Don Juan Matus, the mentor of Carlos Castaneda. And he looked at me, and I ludicrously introduced myself as Carlos Castaneda, spelled with a K. Because my name is spelled with a K. And Don Juan just pierced me with this stern look, and which was sort of conveying this intolerance to my ridiculous antics. And I discontinued my stupidity immediately at this glance, aware that he had something serious to teach me. And he motioned to me with his chin in the direction of this other man, who was a strongly built Native American Indian with dark olive skin, having long dark hair, which was partly tied back over the top of his head. And Don Juan says to me, "This is a Toltec. He is a true warrior." And after this statement, the Indian warrior begins to reach to the side of his face with his fingers, with both hands, and then proceeds to tear back the flesh of his cheeks apart. And as he does so, this shimmering rainbow of opal-colored light is revealed beneath the surface of his skin. And I'm just mesmerized by this scene unfolding before my eyes. Then the woman returns into the room, and she stands directly in front of me, her face just about a foot away from mine. And as she stands before me, I witness this eye beginning to open within the middle of her brow. And seeing the flesh upon her mid-brow open to reveal this third eye shocked me so much that I began to rapidly retreat out of this dream world. And I found myself being pulled backwards down a dark tunnel away from the scene before me. And as I was retreating out this tunnel, I see her at the end of the tunnel smiling at me knowingly, and then she blows me a kiss in farewell. Now, I'm on the boat on the Nile, and I awake with a start, and I'm feeling as though I'd been sucked down this tunnel back into my body. And the lucidity of this dream was extremely intense. My heart was racing, and the last image of this woman blowing me a kiss as I moved down the tunnel was really at the forefront of my mind. And as my mind kicked in, I immediately began to consider that the Carlos Castaneda books, which I'd been reading over the past week, had obviously had an influence upon my dreaming, and that it was perhaps ridiculous to consider that I'd actually had an encounter with this teacher, Don Juan Matus. Yet there was something about this dream encounter that was all too real, and I knew I'd experienced something deeply profound in the presence of that mysterious woman. And I later wondered at the possibility that the dream had also been some type of astral initiation that may have occurred as a result of visiting the temples I'd been in over the previous week, or perhaps not attending the temple on the island of Philae physically, but perhaps entering that temple in some type of astral initiation. Well, this encounter would have more significance to me in following years during a later trip to Mexico, which I will describe in another presentation. But the next leg of my trip through Egypt involved crossing the desert to visit the Red Sea. And we were given a couple of days to relax by the Red Sea in a 5-star resort, which was quite luxurious compared to the past 2 weeks of travel. And I made the most of the creature comforts while they were available, using the spa, and pool, and the beach to maximum benefit. The highlight of this resort for me was snorkeling amongst the coral reef that was available right on the doorstep of this motel. Now, the first night of our stay on the Red Sea, we dined at the resort restaurant. It had this large buffet meal that was by far the best that I'd experienced in Egypt. And the second night of our stay, our tour guide operator had recommended that we hire a small bus and travel along to a coastal village about 20 minutes away. He'd highly recommended this seafood restaurant in this small coastal village, advising that it had the freshest, most delicious seafood that we'd ever experience. And so on this recommendation, the majority of the group, except the guy who I'd been sharing a room with named Pete, we all made the option to travel down the coast that evening. I was a little reluctant to leave the culinary safety that I knew could be attained from the resort restaurant, but I figured I was in Egypt for the adventure and I might as well make the most of it. This fateful decision, however, led me into a comedy of errors that lasted the entire evening. So during the past 2 weeks in Egypt, I'd experienced some of the chaos that is Egyptian driving, but I wasn't quite ready for the experience of driving across the desert by night. We'd been warned about driving in Egypt before leaving home, yet it really has to be experienced to be believed. Now, that night, while traveling to this small coastal village, my concept of faith was tested. The sun had just set and quickly became quite dark over the desert, and the people on the bus began to become quite nervous as to why the driver wasn't turning his headlights on. And we soon realized that he had no intention of turning them on. And before long, it was very difficult to see very far ahead of the bus. And we were making our way down this highway in pitch dark. And occasionally you'd see a flash of headlights ahead from vehicles traveling in the opposite direction. You'd get this little signal a few seconds before a semi-trailer would come past the side of the bus, and it was quite unnerving. And when our tour operator was asked about this, he explained that some of the Egyptian men are very proud and literally believe that Allah will show them the light, as well as the fact that during times of conflict in this area of Egypt, bullets would be fired at the cars that could be seen by their headlights driving at night. Now, several of the group members that were on this bus that had been part of this tour began to form an alliance and began demanding that the driver turn on his headlights because they were feeling so unsafe. And this request, however, was not going to be met, and many of the group members became very angry. Some of them were gripping the backs of seats, white-knuckled, and as I began to look at the concern on the faces of everyone, I couldn't help but start to laugh at how absurd the entire situation was. And I just sort of surrendered and said, okay, I'm just going to have faith here in this driver. He obviously knows what he's doing. But the more angry that the group members got, the more hysterical it became for me. So about half an hour later, we arrived in this little coastal town, and everybody's appetites seemed to have been quite stimulated by the drive there. We ended up going to this restaurant, and on arrival, we find that we're just sitting on drums that were for seats, and the table was a very simple structure made of these drums with some boards placed over the top of it. Now, being in Egypt, it's a third world country for the most part, and you don't really come to expect much. But that night, because the tour operator had hyped this restaurant and the seafood so much, everyone was kind of expecting a bit more. And so they're quite disappointed when we got there. And when we got there, there was cockroaches walking around on the table and whatnot. It was quite unhygienic. And some of the members of this group began to become quite obnoxious and start to have pot shots at the tour operator. And there was one in particular, an Australian man who was quite obnoxious, loud and arrogant. He was somewhat likable and humorous most of the time, but he didn't mind speaking his mind. And so as the waiter came out, the waiter gave us all menus and then began to explain that there was basically nothing on the menu, that there was only one type of fish that they had, everything else on the menu they didn't have. And so basically everyone was left with just being able to have one type of fish and chips. So everyone was getting more and more angry at this, and I was laughing more and more in hysteria at how angry everybody else was getting. And then when the food was finally served, it came out and it had been so deep fried that there was basically no potato left in the chips, no fish underneath the batter, and it was basically unedible. So everyone gets back on the bus for another drive back to the resort in darkness, hungry, tired, and angry. And I'm still in hysteria, laughing my head off. Well, we get back to the resort where we'd been staying, and I run into the guy who I was sharing a room with, an American guy named Pete, and I explained what had happened over dinner, and we had a bit of a chuckle about that, and then discussed what our plans were the following day. He explained that he was going to stay at the resort so that he could do some more scuba diving for another day, and I said that I was going to go back to Cairo because I really wanted to visit the pyramids and the Sphinx again. And so after this, we brush our teeth and go to sleep. Now, Pete and I had been sharing this motel room and a room upon the boat for almost 2 weeks. And I was used to being woken up occasionally if he rolled out of bed in the middle of the night to go to the toilet. Now, that evening, in the early hours of the morning, I lightly woke up because I sensed Pete's footsteps walking across the room towards the toilet. And I was somewhat surprised when he stopped at the end of my bed and sat down on the mattress, and my left foot just began rolling over and tilted to one side as the mattress sank down with his weight in that area. And, I began thinking to myself, what's he doing sitting on the end of my bed in the middle of the night? And my mind starts proposing, well, I suppose he must be getting up to go for a walk somewhere, and he's sat down to put his shoes on in the dark. And perhaps he thinks he's sitting on his bed rather than mine because we're in the dark. And I just lay in bed waiting for him to get up and leave, thinking that it was a bit odd, but otherwise I wasn't too concerned by it. And what seemed like a few minutes went by, and I began wondering what he was still doing sitting on the end of my bed, thinking, what the hell is he doing there? And then my mind starts trying to explain, well, he hasn't moved the whole time. And I thought, well, maybe he's not sitting on my bed. Maybe he's partially rolled out of his bed, which was about a meter away, and maybe it's his leg pressing on my mattress. And I'm thinking, no, that's ridiculous. His bed's too far away. And then my mind gets really creative and starts thinking, well, maybe he's attracted to me. Maybe he's gay and he's up to something weird. Now, another few moments passed with me searching for logical explanations for this strange behavior, when all of a sudden this voice of another awareness comes into my mind, and it simply says, "It's not him." And that's all it said to me. And my mind starts looking for answers, saying, well, if it's not him, who is it? And so I'm questioning this after realizing full well that it's not Pete sitting on the end of my bed. And I'm thinking, this is really strange. This is just like what happened at the workshop a few weeks ago. And I lay completely still, continuing to question this situation. And as I did so, this being just begins to stand up and walk away. And my foot begins to return to its previous position on the mattress. And I suddenly become very alert and think that I need to check this situation out to see if it had been Pete sitting on my bed. So I quickly flick on the lights and I look about the room, and I see Pete waking kind of sluggishly from under his bed covers. The doors were closed, nobody else was in the room, and he asks what's going on, why I'd woken him with the light. I apologize, and then I'm lying in bed, my heart's racing, knowing what's just transpired, but I'm still looking for rational explanations. And so I switch the light back on, and I'm investigating, and I'm asking him, did he happen to just get out of the bed and sit on the end of my bed, and he doesn't know what I'm talking about. And I have a bit of a laugh about it, and then I explain to him what I've just experienced. And eventually go back to bed, turn the light off, and I lay there and I'm trying to get to sleep, and I'm actually thinking, well, maybe if I just relax and I get into a different brainwave state, that I'll be able to, this being might return, but I was way too excited. And eventually, it must have been about 4 a.m. in the morning when this occurred, and eventually the sun began to come up, and so I put on some shoes and decided to go for a walk along the Red Sea. And I sat watching this beautiful sunrise and just knew that my reality was never going to be the same again. So after that day, on my travels back to Cairo, I began remembering the story that I'd been told in the previous workshop a couple of weeks ago that I explained about the king or the queen in the castle. And you can view that on a previous presentation that I gave. And the king or the queen being your mind trying to explain, rationalize, or convince you of the reality that you're used to. And there were far too many holes in my reality at that time. I knew that things, the experiences that I'd had in Egypt, the course of my life was never going to be the same. And as the day went on, I also began to consider everybody's behavior at dinner during the previous evening. And as I explained in the past presentation, that this was a form of signature behavior when there is interdimensional interaction happening. Oftentimes our mind, as it's going into different brainwave frequencies and having these interactions, it's very challenged. And so we, as I explained, we may get angry, we may get hyperactive, or we may become hysterical, as I was the night before during this bus ride and dinner, where I couldn't stop laughing at everybody. And so that's the reason that I've presented such a lengthy story about the dinner the previous night, because everybody was experiencing this signature behavior prior to me having this encounter within my dream state, when I was in a deeper brainwave state with a being that came and sat on the end of my bed. And I'll explore more about my understanding of that experience in future presentations. So the following day, I took a bus to return to Cairo, and I booked a taxi for the next morning to pick me up and take me to the Great Pyramid. And having begun my training to become a facilitator of the Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life workshops, which were originally delivered by Drunvalo Melchizedek, I had an immense fascination with these Egyptian pyramids, and I wanted to make the most of this possibility of being able to enter into them. So I arrived quite early that morning so as not to miss getting one of the tickets to enter the Great Pyramid. I was the first one to go in. I said good morning to the guards. They explained I was very privileged to be the first in that day. And as soon as I entered, I was so excited. And I headed straight up towards the King's Chamber, just marveling at this superior craftsmanship that had gone into the construction of the Great Pyramid. And I inspected the sarcophagus, knowing that it had potentially been a place of final initiation for many in these ancient Egyptian mystery schools. And with this in mind, I decided to sit on the floor and do the Merkaba meditation. And I was reflecting upon everything that I had experienced over these previous couple of weeks during my travels, and how this journey had been one of lifting many veils between the dimensions. So I did this Merkaba breathing, and I gave blessings and thanks to everyone upon my travels, in particular those that I had experienced the Seed of Life workshop with a couple of weeks earlier. And when I completed this meditation practice, the other couple of hundred tourists who had purchased tickets that morning began to make their way up into the King's Chamber. And I just began casually strolling amongst them all. And about half an hour or so passed, and I watched them all come in with these guards. And then they all began to file out of the King's Chamber, and they left me in there all alone. And all the guards had left, and I was in there by myself for the next 2 hours. And so I went back into meditation. Of course, I got in the sarcophagus and continued to meditate. And as I did so, this experience of bilocation again began to come on. And although it was not as strong as I had experienced a couple of weeks earlier while in America, this was perhaps because my mind was so active and I was finding it challenging to be calm due to my excitement of being in the pyramid alone. I began to sense myself as though I was being pulled energetically through these tunnels into different parts of the pyramid. But my mind would eventually kick in with this excitement and knock me out of this awareness that I was having. At one stage, I found myself floating as though I was in space or water very far away. So I spent 2 hours in the pyramid, and then eventually I came out. I said goodbye to the guards who were at the entrance to the pyramid and were quite surprised to see me emerge several hours later. And I returned to the taxi to find my driver there sleeping. And as I departed, my final thoughts were that I really must have had some friends in high places that had orchestrated this entire event and the encounters that I'd had over the previous weeks while traveling through Egypt. So I know that this has been quite a lengthy talk, and I thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope that you may have gained something in doing so, and I look forward to continuing to explain my perception of these experiences and further initiations that I've had in previous years after this trip through Egypt. If you would like to continue this journey with me and more episodes of Future Self Dreaming, please hit the subscribe button, and you can check out offerings on the website futureselfdreaming.com and follow Future Self Dreaming on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you, in Lakesh.